Well, welcome everyone to another edition of the NatCon Australia podcast. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Greg Copley. Greg is a strategic analyst who for over half a century has worked at the highest levels with various governments around the world. He currently serves as the president of the Washington-based International Strategic Studies Association and is editor-in-chief of the online journal Defence and Foreign Affairs Strategic Policy. Born in Western Australia, he's a member of the Order of Australia and is the author or co-author of over 35 books. Welcome, Greg.
Great, thank you. And just a reminder, the Strategic Policy Journal is still a print journal as well as an online journal, so can't give up the print.
No problem. I'll direct people to that in the show notes and anything else you want to alert people about at the end of the show too. I must admit, I was not as familiar with your work as I probably should have been, but in discussions with various people in business and in academia through my network, your name has come up in various circles as someone I should speak to, who's someone who has, not only as an Australian based in Washington, D.C., but someone who has genuine experience, not only with the movers and shakers of power there over many, many years, but also with people around the world. How did you end up in Washington, D.C.?
Well, I'd like to think that I haven't ended up here, and that I'll still be able to lay my bones in some form of monarchy somewhere around the world, if that's not Australia. But basically, we've been working around the world with governments for many years, over 50 years, as you noted, and we've kept a very, very low profile. In fact, our organization is not a think tank as such. It's basically an intelligence analysis organization based on original human input, human intelligence input. We've, over the last 52 years in particular, built a network of correspondents, shall we call them that, around the world, some 200 or so of them, who basically feed material into us on an ongoing basis. We've had many decades, in most instances, to learn their biases and the level of penetration they have, the level of access they have. So we get to grade the input of raw intelligence from them, and we're able to analyze it over a period of many, many years. In fact, what we try to do is discern patterns in the behavior of peoples, societies, and of course of individuals in leadership positions. So we're looking at a grand strategy perspective of things. I have particularly been advising a number of governments at senior levels, virtually all of whom I can't talk about because that was the nature of the work we've done. But a few of them have come to light. I mean, I was the Shah of Iran, for example, admitted that I was his advisor on many things. Unfortunately, he didn't listen at the end, but that was for reasons which he had, which were quite good, and also because of a lot of betrayal within the Sadabad Palace at that time. But he was a highly intelligent and thoughtful and broad thinker, one of the greater thinkers of the era. But that was an era also when we saw a number of leaders who really understood the world. And that's hardly the case today around the world. Mostly we find politicians who are very, very narrowly focused. They're focused primarily on election and re-election, and not about the good of their country or even understanding what that could be, or understanding the tenets of grand strategy, which include the defining of policies and goals, strategic goals for their countries on the basis of understanding them. You might know that I've co-authored with another West Australian, Andrew Pickford, a book called Australia 2050, early in this century. And we looked at Australia's outlook through the mid-century. And in that, which was an open document, we started saying, you've got to define what Australia is. You've got to define where Australia wishes to be by 2050. And we couldn't even find one Australian who could adequately define what an Australian was as a person, nor what his values were, or his or her values were, and what we wanted from the world and from ourselves by mid-century. I mean, and this is not uncommon with most countries around the world, but it's particularly the case with our own country, Australia, is that people are very, very complacent. They are very trusting in government. We're seeing that erode today, as we're seeing it erode, the trust in governance erode globally, because of a variety of betrayals by government, some intentional, some not intentional, and some through basically failing to understand their own history and their own culture, their own peoples. But basically, that's where we move today. And as I say, I did have a number of high-profile endeavours outside this field, in shipyards and airlines and so on, in chemical countries, in companies in Europe and so on, particularly in the United Kingdom, for many years. But frankly, it was never as satisfying as trying to understand and know what was going on and how it could be shaped for the better, which is why I was always contacted by a number of governments who over many years asked me to advise them on things like setting up constitutional changes, setting up their intelligence infrastructures and the like. And that was very, very rewarding. Invariably, however, you see that the perfect always gives way to the venal, and that, for example, people want to build power bases and bureaucracies, and these tend to be counterproductive.
How has gathering human intelligence changed over the years? I think, in my time in Hong Kong, there's something called the Foreign Correspondence Club, which you're probably familiar with. And there used to be these foreign correspondents, which used to file stories, and there used to be individual, people who were attaches, who were effectively spies for whatever embassy they're attached to. But that's sort of been a bit outdated now in some respects, right? Because anyone can file anything from anywhere. You're not waiting on the dispatch from the New York Times reporter in Beijing to find out what's going on there. So has that changed the nature of the work that you do as well?
Perhaps, but the reality is that it's only highlighted the difference between understanding and reacting. What we see with reporting, and that has increasingly become the case with intelligence reporting as well, is that we see this as a reactive function instead of a preemptive or overall continuum of affairs where you start to look at where things are going. It's less important to focus on what somebody has said or done than it is to understand the context within which it has been said or done, so that you can see it as a part of a growing pattern. And in the human role, if you see that a major player makes a statement which contradicts the trends which you've observed over the decades, you then know that something has really happened, and then you need to investigate why that happened. What we tend to do is report that as the news without saying, well, hang on, does it make sense that he said this? And if he said it contrary to popular logic, then why did he say it? And you can find out much more that way. And somebody said, how do you know, how are you able to forecast certain activities? And they say, well, you sit and look at a situation for 50 years and pretty soon a pattern emerges. But we did do that early on as well. I mean, I remember one instance when we published on April 10th, 1972, that the Egyptians were going to throw out all of the Soviet military advisors from Egypt. And I said within 6 months. And the sourcing was particularly good and irrefutable, in fact. And we published that, and the CIA came at us in a number of different directions, off the record, to say, "What are you, crazy? How do you think the Soviets can operate without? Sorry, the Egyptians can operate without the Soviets. They need them spares for their T-62 tanks, their MiG-21s and MiG-23s, and so on. They can't do without the Soviets." And I said, nonetheless, this is the decision made by Anwar Sadat, and this is going to happen. And within about 4 months, in fact, Sadat had removed the Soviets from Egypt. And there are all of these kind of instances where having the right human is critical. When, for example, things were getting very interesting after the President Salvador Allende took power in Chile and was building up a pro-Soviet operation there, and was then overthrown by General Pinochet. Then we started to see a lot of activity in South America, and we had very good information from Peru that Peru was buying, I think it was Sukhoi 24s to install, and the CIA was not aware of that at the time, and it took a lot of people by surprise. Now, okay, so these are lucky incidents, and certainly they were, but it was because we had trusted people embedded in all of these governments around the world who gradually worked with us, not because we were a Western intelligence agency, which we absolutely were not, nor that we were connected with any governments. We certainly looked to basically obtain indications of what was going on and how and why it was going on, particularly, and not looking at it from just a purely military or a purely political or purely economic standpoint, but looking at all of the factors, cultural, regional, and very much global issues, how they affect the regions and the countries concerned, and why they do what they have to do. So once you start to see that whole pattern emerging, you stop worrying about some day-to-day things, including, by the way, the acquisition of the Sukhois by Peru, which was merely an indicator of trends which we knew were underway. And the trend at that particular time was that Peru, Argentina, and Bolivia had been planning to invade Chile because they thought it was vulnerable and isolated under Pinochet, and that they were going to be able to get away with a coordinated invasion of Chile for their own separate reasons, but they were coordinating. And so you go back into the history, you look at how Bolivia had lost its land access to the Pacific and so on. And you look at the case of Egypt, with the frustration of being a great power or a great historical power suddenly being dictated to in a fairly heavy-handed way by a foreign power, because the Soviets were not regarded by the Egyptians as culturally or somehow civilizationally superior. But so you start to see why people viscerally react to these issues. And we see the West, particularly in the past few decades, going into situations without a deep understanding of the cultures and language and so on. When they went into Iraq, for example, there were like 2 Arabic speakers in the US Embassy, for example, one of the biggest US embassies in the world, with only a couple of Arabic speakers. How do you understand it? The same with the Balkans wars in the 1990s. We saw people there who thought that they could learn the situation within weeks and so on, with little or no language training, which is fine. I mean, you can, but the thing is, they hadn't read any of the history, and they didn't listen to the long-term historians who had been embedded in the region to look at the nuances of why various nation states and cultures within that region did certain things, or how this was likely to play out. Where were the likely strengths? What was the likely reaction of the various players to events going to be? I mean, it's just a matter of the West losing a lot of its understanding and hoping to replace that with hubris and basically saying, well, this is how we see the situation and that's how it's going to be, and this invariably fails. So try to take a more subtle approach to this and understand the nuance and what are the building blocks of societal motivations. That's the key. Why should we resist what is popular and populist? Why do we see global mass psychoses appear around the world from time to time, as they have been over the past decade, or 2 decades particularly? We saw this with the Children's Crusade. Was that in the 12th century, I think it was, when all of a sudden children were going to decide what was morally correct about retaking the Holy Land and so on. And so you had this insane vision, which does remind you of Greta Thunberg, for example, leading the global climate change alarm around the world. So, these patterns reemerge. We saw it, of course, with the mass psychosis over COVID, how this was used as a political lever once it escaped, and as a result, it shaped a lot of governments thinking that they could now use authoritarian means to basically get past what had been necessary mostly historically, which was the consensus, the social contract, if you like, and you start to see these patterns of behavior changing around the world, and the decline or the rise of political parties. And we're now in a period of the decline of the political party based on global mass movements, for example.
Yeah, there's just no substitute, is there, for thoughtful, seasoned intelligence assets, people that and have built up trust with. They're just so superior to a journalist that flies in and files a story and effectively just regurgitates what different people are telling him or her. There's been a lot of talk in the podcast world and press recently about all of the activities that states get up to covertly. How does one strike the balance between operations that a state needs to conduct to secure its interests and what its nation's citizens should be entitled to know?
I mean, that's the eternal question, and everybody justifies the needs for secrets, which I understand. And some things if you hand out your secret knowledge on certain issues, in some instances, it'll be cited or absorbed out of context, and that's a critical failure. You can take, as we see with open government statements or politician statements, you take a few words or a sentence out of context, you can change the whole meaning or understanding of the situation. So one of the situations which we find ourselves in today is that you can't trust governments because they are there for self-preservation. You can't trust the media because they are a creation which has now gone off the rails in terms of discipline. I was initially trained as a journalist. I was actually a young lad on the West Australian as aviation correspondent there in my teens. And the disciplines which we held immutable were that you didn't even use adjectives except as physical descriptors, like a color or something like that. You refrained from personalizing an interpretation of that about which you were writing. And that was critical. And of course, that's abandoned entirely today. Things which are taken as read, as truth, that, for example, the thing is Trump is always lying, so therefore he lies and the other guys don't. Or the other way around. It's ludicrous to assume that any of this is meaningful, or that you should waste your time pursuing that, because that doesn't tell you what the underlying direction of the country is, or the world is going through. So essentially, governments are going to do what they do. You have to assume that they have a certain logic in doing something and a reason, therefore, for doing it. And it's up to you to find out what that is, because quite often the players themselves don't necessarily understand it. They perpetuate their patterns of behavior because this is what we did before. This is what we've always done, and so on. You look at the situation today in the Middle East, and the US is, whether it's under Biden or Trump, anxious to recapture, if you like, the goodwill of Saudi Arabia. And that's understandable. Saudi Arabia is an important player in many respects. And yet, unconsciously, the US has allowed itself to have its policy dictated by Saudi Arabia. The war against or with Yemen, for example, right now is because Saudi Arabia wants that war, because Saudi Arabia is concerned and has always been concerned about the Yemenis, because they have the, if you like, the cultural and historical, tribal legality and moral superiority over the House of Saud as the traditional governors of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. They are al-Hashimi, the Hashemites, who were entrusted with this mission by the Prophet Muhammad. So we say, what does this matter to us today? The reality is that the legitimacy of the House of Saud as the guardians of these holy cities, and therefore as the guardians, if you like, of much of Islam, is undermined by the existence, the very existence of the al-Hashimi in both Yemen and Jordan and so on, and to a degree in Iraq. But the so we've, and why is the US attacking or at war with the Houthi rebels, as they put that in quotes? These are not Houthi rebels. These are the northern Yemeni people. This is a government of a country with a greater population than Australia, which has never been successfully dominated by anybody but them. The Egyptians and the Saudis in the 50s learned this to their peril. The Egyptians withdrew their forces after some years of fighting in Yemen to try to overthrow the crown of Yemen at the time, because these are mountain people who are very, very good at what they do. And the Saudis will not even go into Yemen to fight them. They got the Emiratis, the UAE and Bahraini forces to go into the country. They got the US fighting them. And the Yemenis are saying, hey, if you are going to listen to Saudi Arabia as a dictating your policies, then we are going to make our voices heard. And yes, they took help from the Iranians, but they are not an Iranian proxy either. But so what do? We don't attempt to say to the Saudis, well, we need you, we respect you, we'll help protect you, but let's not just have you tell us what to do about Yemen, because the Red Sea and Suez Canal sea lane is critical to the US and the world trading system, and you in Riyadh can't necessarily dictate what that's going to be all about. So these are the sort of historical factors which people don't want to hear about. They want to bring it down to very simple slogans, and which Lenin said, if I can reduce an argument to a slogan, I have won the war.
Yeah. Look, there's just so much of what's presented in the mass media, particularly about foreign conflicts or areas of interest, is incredibly simplistic. They've only got so much time, in fairness, I suppose. But the problem is that those simplistic slogans or those simplistic reports do gin up the population and then cause the politicians to respond, who also haven't given much thought to what's going on in Yemen or elsewhere. And then, commitments are made quickly and doesn't always work out as planned. To me, there's a crisis of competency. I mean, I can sort of perhaps accept much more, covert operations by the state if I had much more confidence in the people that were carrying it out, who were in former times, like you say, much more versed in language and culture and the frameworks, geopolitical frameworks for understanding things. But I doubt that is the case anymore, and that the motivations and what they get up to is much more influenced by short-term political thinking and just superficial understanding of what's going on. There has been a change in Washington, right? And we are the new Trump administration is replacing the heads of department with people, in most cases, who are not long-term bureaucrats. Perhaps it's worth just giving us Australians a sense of what the mood's like in Washington and what we should be prepared for under the new Trump administration.
Well, I think you can be assured that this is an administration which has a fairly unified or harmonious view of the world and how it's going to prosecute the US position in that world. That doesn't mean that all the minor details have been sorted out, but this is not going to be like the first Trump administration, which felt that it would rely on the goodwill of the civil servants and long-term politicians and military and bureaucrats of Washington, D.C. They found out that they were betrayed immediately and deeply by that, what they now come to call the deep state. But people in Washington will do anything to preserve their positions and their careers. And they don't understand it. I mean, the same in Washington, in Canberra, for example, or Whitehall. You see, it becomes about their security personally, and there's no growth in their perspective of the world. You look at the way, for example, Canberra deals with Australia's own immediate environment in Southeast Asia, New Guinea, the South Pacific, New Zealand, and the like. Virtually no understanding of that region. It's if you're talking about Fiji, it's the view of Fiji from Canberra, which is paternalistic. It's historically out of date, and it doesn't understand how to treat with its neighbors and so on in an open and trusting fashion. And the United States has been in that position for a long time. And when you're talking about global powers, people are expected to understand the global superpower. The global superpower is not expected to understand the smaller countries. And that was the case with Britain to a degree, and with Rome. You disagree, we will crush you in one way or another. Doesn't necessarily mean militarily, but we'll disregard your views and thoughts because you're a lesser person than we are because we have all the money. And that's been the way of history. If you have the wealth and power, then you are going to dictate the terms. But in so doing, you often overlook things which could be, ways in which things could be done more efficiently or more harmoniously and more cost effectively, for that matter. The United States has really run itself for the past 70 years on the basis it doesn't matter if we waste money. We're so rich, we can do whatever we want, and we'll just, if we make a mistake, it doesn't matter because we'll recover. It's not existential to the life of the United States. That's now over. The United States, to a degree, at least 51% or so of the population is aware that the United States cannot continue doing that because it is now losing ground. It's lost ground in education. It's now way down the list of the best educated countries. It's no longer the wealthiest countries, one of the wealthiest countries per capita. As an overall society, it's way up there. In fact, its asset base is so dramatic that to compare the People's Republic of China with the United States is ludicrous, because the United States has actually a substantial asset base because it is a society which still values free ownership of property and the ability to transfer property down the generations and the like. People's Republic of China doesn't have that, and so its Chinese economy is hollowed out and is collapsing. The US is going through a hard time, but it can rebuild itself. It may not, because it may continue to follow the path of saying, well, we can do what we like, and regardless of how inefficient it is and how corrosive it is to our long-term security and values, they could continue to do that. And I think that's what would have happened had we not seen a major transformation in the governance of the US with the November 5th elections. Not to whether you like or dislike President Trump or President Biden is irrelevant. The reality is this was a massive transformational shift which stopped a lot of the corrosive behavior over the past 4 years, and basically which has occurred historically.
Yeah, I find it very frustrating in the Australian press because they inevitably just describe Trump's actions as based on transactionalism, or he's a deal maker, this sort of stuff, as though there's no broader framework of understanding for why people he's taking the action he's on trade, or there's changes in or the health department and other things, and in foreign policy and immigration, all these areas. It's just simply it's transactional, as though that's I don't know. There's this a superficial take on things in a nutshell. That said, there is on trade, because that's important. It's important for Australia, and how we should what we should do in our trade settings, and how we should interact with the United States and China on that is something that needs greater reflection in Australia and hasn't today. People have basically thought that they know the answer, and they haven't even accepted there's any problems with the current settings, and they certainly haven't given any thought to what a new type of arrangement should look like. And that will be, and sorry, just to keep going on, that will also be an issue that some of our bigger commodity competitors like Brazil also will need to think through. And we can play it badly or we can play it well, but there will be, depending on how we play, the result will be different. So, a long preamble, but what should our trade framework with the United States be like going forward?
Well, it's got to be based on mutual interests. I mean, and this basically is what Trump has been saying as well. I mean, everyone listening to the headlines of the launch of the negotiating position, if you like, which is tariffs, demands of greater local expenditure in defense and so on to live up to the treaty obligations and all of that sort of thing. All well and good. But we have to remember that transactionalism is not really what Trump's about. Yes, he is the master of the deal, and he is an incredibly good negotiator, and that's why he leads with these massive signals of imminent punishment to trading partners. But the reality is he's not going to enter into punitive trading arrangements with Australia or Canada, New Zealand, or the United Kingdom, except to make certain points. He knows that there are retaliatory trade arrangements which can be made by its trading partners. But with the case of the United States versus the People's Republic of China, the People's Republic of China is not trading just for the sake of trade. Yes, it has in the past, until Xi Jinping came along, and particularly during the Deng Xiaoping period, tried to gain economic ground, and perfectly understandable from a normal societal standpoint, not necessarily understandable from a Marxist Maoist point of view, but it's understandable. So Trump will be hard on the PRC because he needs to make sure that it will not revive as a strategic competitor anytime soon. And if possible, I mean, he would certainly go along with something which would bring about the downfall of Xi Jinping, which may already be well underway, in fact, and I believe it is well underway, but also to ultimately see the collapse or the reduction in power and orientation of the Communist Party of China. So the reality is that the transactional society was not invented by Trump. Trump is good at doing it, but he tries to do it for a greater good in many respects. He's looking for global strategic advantage for the United States, rebuilding the core of the United States as a self-sufficient power able to trade less, if you like, in proportion to its GDP than it is today. Today, of course, the United States is massively dependent upon the import of foreign manufactured goods. So he's going to start eroding that process, as he did in his first term, by building the independent energy base to the state where the US is a mass exporter of energy, and that's fairly relatively easy. He can do that in a way which also boosts Canada in this light, and there's no question that although he has had good discussions with Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada lately, he basically sees Trudeau as being the enemy of the liberty and growth of Canada, and Trump would want in a post-Trudeau government to see a revival of the Canada-US energy integration.
Now, there was that famous piece of who knows what to believe. Apparently it was true. Trump posted, I believe, about it on his own Twitter social media account, saying that he joked to Justin Trudeau that Canada should become the 51st state of the United States and he could be the governor. And it's a throwaway line, but there's always been this issue with Canada because it wants to maintain an independent country, but it has to choose at some level, doesn't it? Because it can't, for example, have open trade relationship with China and have goods coming into Vancouver duty free, and then while the United States maintains a posture with China that tries to restrict trade, because otherwise goods can just flow ultimately across the border, even with the best rules of origin, rules and everything else. It's just not going to be possible. So you either join, you become closer and closer part of the American customs union, or you stay out of it, but you lose the benefit of your trade access to the United States. And it seems to me Australia also potentially is in that quandary, because at the moment we contribute, tribute to the United States. We pay a lot of money we're paying a lot of money for the subs. We import a lot more from the United States than we export to them. So tariffs, are not really, there's no logic to imposing huge tariffs on us. But we will in due course have an issue if we continue to, John Howard likes to say we don't have to choose between our biggest customer and our biggest strategic ally. But I don't know whether that in history that's ever been the case, that someone can have incredibly integrated trading relationships with one strategic nation, which is an adversary, or at least a strong competitor of another. We at some point we either integrate more closely with the United States, like Canada will likely be forced to do, or we choose to, I don't know, integrate more closely with China even than we're doing now. What do you think? How should that play out?
Yeah. Look, China's finished. China is in economic collapse at the moment, in severe economic collapse. I make speeches around Australia talking about this. Nobody understands it. But the People's Republic of China is bankrupt. The Belt and Road Initiative has run out of cash. They've got very little money to invest in that. And yet the Belt and Road Initiative was never built to fruition. In other words, it's incomplete. So they're not getting the benefit of the Belt and Road Initiative, and never will, because they ran out of cash. Xi Jinping did not understand what to do with the wealth. He didn't understand money, didn't understand wealth. He basically thought the only way to win influence is going to be to adopt Maoism, but nobody these days will listen to Mao's little red book, but they will listen to Mao's little red checkbook. And so he just spent money, threw it away, bribed, corrupted, invested in deals which were not practicable. And as a result, he's now got nothing. And so since about 2015, you've seen very little progress in the Belt and Road Initiative. A lot of lip service to it, and you get the wolf warrior diplomacy, which is basically bluster very loudly. And look, as much as I like John Howard, and he's an incredibly decent person. He doesn't understand grand strategy at all. He's, in a sense, transactional, because if you understand about what makes a country great, and I'm not talking about the United States or the People's Republic of China, I'm talking about Australia. If you wanted to understand what would make Australia great, is you have to have a vision for Australia, not a vision about sitting on the fence between China and the United States. And I don't believe that the United States should be the master and dictator of Australia's destiny. They can be very good allies, but Australians don't want to take leadership. And the Canadians have been that way to a degree as well. The Kiwis, definitely. But the reality is we want our parents to tell us what to do, and we never want to leave home. We are the 30-year-old who's still living in the basement of the parents' home. And when the British collapsed on us in Singapore in 1942, we turned immediately to the United States, bought ourselves a new parent, and we want to keep that. And we want to still go on and say, well, we're now rich, we're the spoiled rich kids, and we're spending the money that China gives us. Well, the reality is China's not going to give us any more money. The fact that they've opened trading with a couple of extra meat exporters from Australia is chicken feed stuff. Australia needs to have a set of goals. It needs to understand who it is, what it is, where it wants to go, and how it can get there within its sphere. And this is why, for example, the Fijian Prime Minister Sitiveni Rabuka understands that better than anybody in Canberra, because he's saying, look, we're going to create this, quote, ocean of peace, which sounds very kumbaya, but in fact it's about saying, let's take charge of our own region, protect what we have, trade with what we have, and help each other within that. And it's basically a supercharged Pacific Islands Forum, and Australia and New Zealand are members of that, and yet we keep talking to these Pacific Islanders as though they're idiots, and we ignore what is potentially our great sphere. So we don't have to choose between the US and China in the sense that we can, still keep taking the drug money, if you like, from China and then running home to daddy to protect us. We need to take charge of our own thought pattern. And that's when it gets deeper. And that's when you can't deal transactionally in the short term, which is what has become of the world under modern leadership. It's literally all about appeasing short-term demands, and that is transactional. Give me your vote, I will give you this. And that is not the way you build a great nation.
Yeah, you wrote a book, which you mentioned earlier, Australia 2050, and it's not what there are sometimes forums in Australia, Australia 2030, it sort of looks out 10 years, but there's not that bigger perspective about where we should go as a nation. It's almost as though in Australia, and I'm not sure whether you agree or disagree with this, but it's as though we lack a sense of self-interest. We are always presenting ourselves as the umpire or the good or the sort of traffic warden. We don't actually think to ourselves, well, what could we be in the way that I like to joke, what would the Normans think? How would they view the world? Would it make sense to them, strategically, economic? But we're almost conditioned not to think that way in Australia.
Yeah. Well, in fact, Roger de Montgomery, who led the conquest for William the Conqueror in 1066, was my direct ancestor.
Oh, there you go.
It's very familiar with his approach. And yes, that's much more pragmatic. It's much more in terms of asking why you would do something. And by the way, I believe that the Normans were not just interested in conquest for the sake of economics, although that was clearly a part of it. They were interested in conquest for the sake, if you like, of the glory and nobility of their society. And if you don't have that as a primary objective, to build the greatness and nobility of your people, then frankly, who are you doing this for? I mean, Australia sheds blood and has shed blood for the last 25 years or more, going back to the Boer War and the Boxer Rebellion. We've been shedding blood for other people for a long time. and yet because we basically thought we don't have to shed it for ourselves, because we're part of this greater union, and we're very happy to be part of the greater union, and we can afford to basically give things away. And we see the Biden administration giving away huge amounts of money to various parts of the world at a time when Americans are financially distressed. And we see that in Australia as well. Australia's basically committing to the kumbaya transactionalism, if you like, without actually thinking about the purpose of it or the ultimate good of it. They're thinking about the feel-good factor. Australians love to be loved. They like to be thought of as lovable larrikins. Well, we're not larrikins anymore. We're just boring. And we need to get up there and say, no, we're going to do something, and we're going to treat our allies and partners as literally as equals, and deal with them and understand them and respect them in that pattern. And we are going to build something great, and we need to take the leadership. It's not happening. You look at the politicians today, not one of the cabinet of Australia, nor one of the Biden cabinet ever had a real job meeting a payroll to employ people. So if you don't understand what it takes to put bread on the table and a roof over your head, then you don't understand the underpinnings of what makes a society tick. The Shah of Iran used to say, look, yeah, I hear what you're saying about all of these rights and so on, but the first right that my people must have is the right to be able to eat and to have shelter. And he was absolutely correct in that. And how do you have dignity if you have to beg? And the question is, you have to build a degree of self-reliance. And that doesn't mean you don't trade or that you become autarkic in the sense that, as Xi Jinping wants mainland China to be autarkic in its internal circular economy, or North Korea for that matter. It means that you can be in command of your own destiny.
What could Australia look like by 2050 if there was much more of a kind of like a feeling for national expansion, rather than adopting this mindset that we are we need to be a good citizen and the umpire in the global trading system? What could we aspire to be, in your view?
Well, look, I think you've got to look at it what it could and probably will be if we don't do anything, because we'll see the collapse of the PRC economy from its own internal problems, which will have a dramatic economic impact on Australia, because we have reduced our own manufacturing capability. We have become subordinate to Singapore for refined petroleum and the like. We haven't taken care our pride has been, or hubris rather than pride. We should have pride in our ability to do things for ourselves. Instead, we have this hubris that we don't need to do things for ourselves. We believe we have become a post-industrial society. In other words, a society which doesn't have to produce anything. It just lives on the labors of other poor unfortunates in Cambodia or Bangladesh, providing us with what we need, or China. And instead, we have to start to say, well, we have to have a fundamental review of who we are, because she won't be right going forward. And if we persist, we will see a continuation of what we have at the moment, which is a massive decline in our GDP per capita and more importantly, our real wealth per capita and real standard of living and standard of consciousness, in a sense, our ability to understand things with wisdom against all of our neighboring states. We have declined in our relative success against India, against Singapore, Malaysia, China, and the like, where we had a very good comparable advantage individually. And we start to say, well, we need more people to make our economy grow. And that actually doesn't work. If India and China were supposed to be rewarded for their populations, then they would have been the world's richest countries for the past few hundred years, but they were not. It's not the size of the population which determines it. It's about making sure that your individual ability for entrepreneurship and self-sustainment is there, and we can do that. So the first thing I would suggest we do is we restrict population intake to people who can actually help. We move our population into areas where we have better advantage, like the north, where we have greater access to water and the like, and closer to points of trade. Bearing in mind that our earlier population centers were driven by the trade winds, the roaring 40s coming across the Southern and Indian Oceans and the like. We have to start to think in more creative terms, and to be willing to accept the dignity, if you like, of being the battling Aussie who actually does some work and is capable of allowing himself to do all manner of tasks to ensure that the objective is achieved. So the first thing is restricting immigration, not encouraging it. Encouraging what immigration you have to be on a much more balanced and competitive basis, both culturally as well as in skill sets, which we're not doing at the moment. We're seeing a massive inflow, particularly of Asian and particularly Indian migrants at the moment into Australia, which is great because they're intellectually brilliant. But how do we integrate them into the cultural values? Why is it that Australians don't want to go and live in India, but Indians want to come and live in Australia, and the Indian migrants are sending huge amounts of money back to India? And this is human nature, and we can't complain about that. It's just perfectly logical, and these are perfectly decent people doing what is necessary for them to do. But we have to look at, okay, what are Australian values? How do we regain pride in them, and how do we project ourselves in a way which is efficient? That doesn't mean we ignore aid or we ignore the ability of Australia to box above its weight in terms of international arbitration, but we have to do that on the basis of skills.
How do we improve our capacity of those in government to understand the practical nature of the world and build up the human resources that you've developed over your career? It's a very cloistered existence that the diplomats live these days, and once they're in the system, they sort of they struggle to get out of it, and in fact they struggle to engage with the street level understanding or speak to more unsavory characters that you might want to keep at an arm's length, but that nevertheless have very useful information to understanding. Why has our capacity, that very useful sort of practical knowledge, deteriorated, and how can we rebuild it?
Well, it's inevitable that when you are given a privileged position and given immunity from dismissal, if you like, from that, in other words, and this applies to politicians even more than to bureaucrats, because we've given politicians access to large amounts of money for very little intellectual input. And this is why I pointed out that none of the cabinet have had any practical experience in helping people and putting food on the table, meeting payrolls, digging ditches or whatever. And they're being immensely rewarded for making decisions with no real input of their own. They are supposed to be the ones who are making policy because they were elected to make policy, and yet they let the bureaucrats make the policy because they don't understand the context and they don't care. Now, I've dealt with people in the Australian intelligence and military communities, all of whom are exceptionally competent by international standards. And yet their first argument when you say, why are we doing this or that? And why don't we do that? They say, oh, you don't understand. We've got access to classified information. Give me a break. I mean, I've had access to the real information for, in many areas, and that you guys don't even begin to understand. And I can, by the way, put you in touch with this or that head of state if you want to start learning about something. But they're not willing to learn because they believe, with Five Eyes particularly, which, you've got this situation, Five Eyes, the world's biggest intelligence exchange operation, which it is, but it's been the stage where you've got these huge pipelines of information or raw data going between the five member states of Five Eyes, US, Australia, UK, Canada, and New Zealand. And yet, what's interesting is that if they're getting access to this world-class intelligence, why are all five governments on different wavelengths about understanding that world? If this was a world-class intelligence exchange with a capacity to provide finished intelligence, analysis, and interpreted intelligence, why is there no common view among the leaders of the Five Eyes countries? There may start to be as we whip, if you like, the Five Eyes into line. And I believe that what we could see over the next few years, if both of those organizations continue to exist, is that Five Eyes and AUKUS could be overlapped to the point where they become one organization and then become an operational, an operational global strategic entity, which can really dominate, if you like, the global security situation and economic situation. I'm not sure that that's going to happen. I'm not sure that Five Eyes is going to remain relevant, or that AUKUS is going to remain relevant, because they're not thinking about that context. You've mentioned that Australia was paying huge amounts to the United States to acquire nuclear submarines, which in part is true, but Australia will not get those Virginia-class submarines, in my estimation, because they are way too expensive for Australia, not only to buy, but to operate. And the United States can't produce enough of them for its own Navy, and the United States will pull the plug on that eventually. Now, we may go on to get the AUKUS Plus class of SSN in relation jointly with the United Kingdom, and we may build some of those in Adelaide or not. But the reality is that these nuclear submarines were going to be too little too late, because we should have made this decision 40 to 50 years ago. And we are now looking at getting submarines of this immense capability and immense cost, much higher cost to Australia than to the Americans. Hang on. And they're going to come into service at a time when submarine technology is going to be far different than it is today, and at a time when the China threat will have disappeared. So we're paying all of this money ostensibly to protect against China. The China threat will have gone. The ability of technologies, anti-submarine technologies, and other active offensive submarine capabilities, unmanned, will be available within 10 years. And yet we're spending $350 billion or whatever it is to acquire the AUKUS Plus and Virginia-class submarines and try to operate them still with the Australian Collins class. 3 classes of submarines in a navy our size? Ridiculous.
So we'll pay all this money and we won't get the subs, but the China threat will have dissipated in any event. So we may not need them, at least to protect against the China threat. So we sometimes muddle through. I mean, in your view, at the moment, what's the area, or where could the threat come from if not China to our strategic security?
Well, I can tell you where it will come from in different forms, and it won't look anything like the potential China threat today, is Russia and India. They are very closely aligned. India has absolute insistence on its right to dominate the Indian Ocean and therefore the ASEAN waterways. It has this absolute belief. When I've asked, for example, one Indian Prime Minister and one Indian Chief of Naval Staff how they could justify that, and they said, well, look, it's the Indian Ocean. And I said, that's a name, which you didn't give it. And by the way, and they said, well, we've got all this coastline on the Indian Ocean. I said, well, here's Western Australia. We've got infinitely more coastline on the Indian Ocean than you have. Besides that, Indonesia has more coastline because of its islands and the like on the Indian Ocean than either India or Australia. But the reality is that India wants to dominate that. It is not an ally of the West. It's a member of the Commonwealth. It's often a very, very good partner. It will deal with the United States and buy United States defense equipment, but it is integrally tied to Russia because Russia is its ultimate guarantor of containing China, whether it's communist China or a post-communist China. Russia has entered into this new transit corridor to basically to rival the Suez, Red Sea, Sea Lane, and the Silk Road. It's created a new international north-south transport corridor, which starts in St. Petersburg, which gives it access to the Atlantic and the Baltic and to the Arctic Ocean and the White Sea, down through the riverine system to the Caspian Sea, and either across the Caspian or down through Azerbaijan to Iran. And now it's the new railroad from the Azerbaijani border down to Chabahar on the Indian Ocean and then over to India.
Where would the clashes between Australia and India likely arise? Over what, where, and over what issues in the Indian Ocean?
Over dominance of the trade routes out of the Red Sea, in and out of the Red Sea, and the Persian Gulf, which Australia finds still very critically important, and around the ASEAN waterways. India has pushed its influence down the East African coast, particularly, and you're looking at Mauritius as one of those, and Madagascar and South Africa. And it's been in severe competition with the People's Republic of China on this issue. It has always had its strong ties into East Africa anyway. So there are a lot of areas there. And it basically, in the same manner as China, sees Australia as either a vehicle or an impediment to access to the greater Pacific areas as well. And what we see is India hoping to eventually be the dominant trading partner with Australia, as mainland China has been in recent years. So again, this may not be a bad thing, and people might say, well, so what? We like the Indians, and it's nice to have an Indian restaurant in every block, the same as the Brits have. So what's the problem? And it's not necessarily a problem. It's about knowing what you're getting into and what you want in terms of the say in your own sovereign affairs and destiny to control the region. Australia can always and easily play the subordinate role, as it's doing now and has done with Britain, done with the United States. And I'm not suggesting in any way that we eliminate or reduce our ties to Britain or the United States. Quite the contrary. They are, in a sense, particularly Britain, the champions of our value system, although Britain has gone off the road a little bit lately because under Labour there, Britain is no longer thinking about what made Great Britain, which is global trade. So we've seen the decline in Western civilization through the decline of Britain, the decline of the United States, not only the decline of Europe through its quasi-Sovietization under the European Union, where we're seeing that, whether we like it or not, our historical underpinnings are the British value system, the Anglo-Celtic tribalism in that sense, which is not necessarily a bad thing, and of course language, and our Judeo-Christian culture. And I understand that modern society is much, much less dependent on traditional religious values, but we are absolutely dependent on maintaining a value system, and we have a perfectly good value system in the Judeo-Christian Western ethos, and we've abandoned that as well. So we've become rudderless to a great degree at a time when we absolutely need to have a value system and to be able to project that onto a future evolution of Australia's ethos and right because we have to see it as a right to take charge of our own destiny, and that means bringing our region along with us because we are the greatest economy in the region.
Yeah, there's so many areas I'd love to talk to you about, but I'm just conscious of time. I mean, you've written a great book on Australians in the air. My uncles who fly would love me to talk about that. You've written a great book on sovereignty, like I mentioned, Australia 2050, and also books on Ethiopia, which is an area that Australians don't really have that much of an knowledge of, and would probably wonder why they should care as much about, but I'm sure you could give very good reasons why they should.
Yeah.
But I guess to conclude, I'd sort of ask, where's the area of the world that you think we should be paying more attention to at the moment as Australians that we're not? Where should we be building up knowledge in that we don't have at the moment?
Well, and I think that it is critical to have a global perspective, and that means literally understanding all of the continents and all of the players. In the shorter term, I think we need to be very careful about building an understanding of Central Asia, because that is the area which is economically going to be very, very interesting for Australian trade and ability to extend our influence. It's increasingly an English-speaking area, which is replacing the Russian as a lingua franca of the region. And that five-state area added to Pakistan and Afghanistan and Iran is the key to keeping, if you like, Russia away from the People's Republic of China. Now, that dynamic will subsequently change, but Central Asia is critical. We have to be critical of places like Ethiopia because it is the dominant power, or has been the dominant power, on the Red Sea, and the Red Sea Suez Canal is critical. So I mean, you can't even say that there's a part which is not interesting and important. And like the British before us, they prided themselves on having people who went native, in the Iraqi marshlands, in the Himalayas, in Africa, and so on. And these wonderful people who became cultural, linguistic, and social observers of these areas were able to create such wisdom that we could actually be truly sophisticated in weighing where Australia needed to go, both culturally and intellectually, and in terms of values. So, I mean, I can't find an area of the world in which I'm not absolutely fascinated. But the other part is Antarctica. Antarctica is terra nullius. It's the last no man's land on the planet. Right now, the Chinese are building increasingly there. They've got 5 major facilities there. The latest one came online this year. Unlike the dictates of the Antarctic Treaty, nobody can have access to those Chinese bases. They've got airstrips, allegedly, to allow you to visit. They're all blocked. So, and Antarctica is Australia's great sovereign advantage, just as much of the Arctic is for Canada. And Australia and Canada should be working together on polar aspects, just as they did when John Franklin was deputy governor of Van Diemen's Land and was fascinated with Antarctic exploration, and then later lost his life, of course, on the Franklin expedition to find the Northwest Passage across north of Canada. These are things we need to be focusing on, and we are not. Again, in Antarctica, we've seen ourselves as this beneficent nation hosting the others to feed off our own natural regional dominion.
Yeah. Look, like I said, I could talk to you for hours. It's a fascinating conversation, and I'm so glad that people put us in touch. It's the right blend, I think, of real practical, detailed knowledge and historical understanding of different regions of the world, as well as a theoretical kind of framework that's put on top of it. And I don't think many people have that great combination. If people want to find out more about you and your work, Greg, where should they go to find that out?
Well, we do have the ISSA, International Strategic Studies Association, has a website, which is strategicstudies.org. So that's probably the best place to look at it. We're frankly so accustomed to not being a public-facing organization that we don't maintain it as well as we should, and this might spur me to get that fixed up in the near future. But on there's ways to contact us. We have a College of Fellows, which is senior people from around the world who have come to us in their retirement or in their active duties. I mean, people like Al Haig and the like, General Field Marshal Abu Ghazala from Egypt, who is a defense minister. Right. All these kinds of people, a very eclectic mix of people who become part of that and give us, if you like, a body of wisdom on which to draw. So people can contact us through that. I'm very happy to talk to people. We do have a LinkedIn page for International Strategic Studies Association as well. But as I say, most of our work is very happily done in the dank darkness of caves, where we start talking to ourselves about what could be.
Well, fantastic, Greg. Great, we've had a chance to chat, and I look forward to catching up in person so we can exchange some real human in person, which probably can't be aired online. And go well, and look forward to chatting further. Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you very much.